So typically what you see in this sort of explanation of this linear space versus this gamma corrected space is this little graph, and we saw that in the minute physics video. And in linear space, the brightness values are in a linear format. But in order for images to look right to our eyes, they often have a skewed curve applied to them with a gamma of 2.2. So and things get a little more complicated than that, but the way I want you to think about it is, let's make my brush size smaller here. This is a gamma of 1, and this is a gamma of 2. Gamma of 1 equals linear, and a gamma of 2.2 equals Srgb. So Srgb is a color profile that you should be familiar with and is pretty common for most images and media that we encounter on the web and on our computers. There are other color profiles. Adobe RGB and Apple, I think, has their own color profiles, but Srgb is kind of a good standard to work with. And this is the color profile that looks right to our eyes, in the sense that mid values of gray appear to be 50% gray kind of thing. Okay, so, but as we saw in the minute physics video, calculations with these colors and with the light information in the context of Maya are correct only in the linear space. And so we want Maya to work in a linear space when it comes to lighting. It has to do with the lighting information. We talked about how lighting has quadratic fall-offs and all of that sort of stuff. But when we look at it, it's not going to make sense for us to look at a linear image. We want to look at an Srgb image. So I'm going to represent our pipeline as this blue line here from left to right. And we're working in Maya here. And there are a variety of places for Maya to do calculations with the color and with the lighting and color information, and for us to actually look at that information and deem whether that's what we're wanting from the image. So the whole idea behind a linear workflow is to keep your calculations and your images in a linear space all the way along the linear workflow until you get to the very end of it, or until you get to a point where you're wanting to export that for the web or for your clients or for something else. So at the very end of the workflow, you want to export that as your final thing into this linear space, or into the gamma corrected space. And this is, in essence, you're applying an Srgb color profile to this, whereas this is linear. Okay? So it's a little bit like how when you're working, like in illustration, in Photoshop, you don't want to be working in a JPEG format. You want to be working in a lossless format, because if you're working in a lossy format like JPEG, every time you save it, you're losing some information and things can degrade. Whereas you want to be working in a lossless format, but any time that you're going to be saving it out for somebody to look at, you can save it out as a JPEG. So this is kind of the similar thing. So as I said, the trick with this is that it doesn't really make sense for us to be reviewing a linear image format. And so there are actually a number of what I'm going to call viewing points and ejection points along the workflow. So what's an example of a viewing point? Well, one example of the viewing point is the viewport, right? I'm just going to So if we've got color information in the viewport, we want to see that in sRgb, but we want the underlying calculations to be in linear space. Similarly with the color picker, if we're choosing colors, we want to choose them in the context of what looks right to our eyes, but we want the underlying values in the color picker to be in the linear space. The same thing with test renders. Okay, so this is actually an ejection point. So basically, I'm meaning that as we're pulling that image out of the pipeline and sending it off to somebody else to look at, right? We're saving that to our disk. And it's fine for those test renders to be in sRgb mode because somebody might be looking at them online. They need to be looking at it with this gamma correction applied. Another point in the pipeline where we're going to be looking at stuff is in our After Effects composition, right? We want After Effects to be doing the calculations in linear space, but when we're looking at the After Effects composition, we want to see the gamma corrected images. And the final export out of After Effects, when we're rendering it to a movie, we want that movie to be encoded in sRgb so that we can put it online on YouTube or Vimeo or wherever we want to do with it, and so that we're looking at it in that space. So this kind of workflow is what you want. What you don't want, in contrast here, is to be working in Maya, you're working along, and then when you are doing your batch renders, to be rendering out into a 2.2 space and then doing your compositing in that space, because any of the calculations along this point, for example, your render passes, you're building up your render passes, if you do those with an sRgb applied, your passes are going to come out wrong. They're not going to add up to your original image. So this is what I mean about keeping things in a linear space, but only when you're looking at them do you actually see the sRgb gamma corrected version of that color space. Okay, so what, in practical terms, what does that actually mean in Maya? Well, before Maya 2016, this was really actually kind of a headache to maintain because the default was that everything was in an sRgb space, and anytime you wanted to render something out, you had to kind of do this inverse jump down to a linear space, this inverse gamma correction, and then you'd render it out, and then all of this actual correction was, a pain to do. So a much better workflow is to have everything in the linear space to begin with. So, and Maya's now made that very easy. Okay, so what does that look like in Maya? The first thing we want to check is that color management itself is turned on. So if we go under Windows, Settings and Preferences, there will be a tab here called Color Management. So we have this Color Management tab, and the first checkbox, Enable Color Management. Yes, we definitely want that on. Color Management is going to manage everything in the Maya interface so that we can view the stuff in the sRgb space, but the calculations are happening in a linear space. The rendering space here, this first drop down, this is, think about it as the calculation space. This is what we want the linear to be. And so there's a few options, but the default is fine, Scene Linear. And they're calling this Scene Linear for Rec 709 or sRgb. So sRgb is probably the most common color space that we're going to want to deal with. So Scene Linear for sRgb is what we're going to want to choose. That's the default. The View Transform is, again, the default sRgb gamma. That's totally fine. And what that means is that that's the view transform going up. I should do this in, pick another color. The view transform, that's going up to this 2.2 gamma. Each of these areas, the viewport, the color picker, these test renders, the view transform is just bringing this image into an sRGB color space for the benefit of our eyes. And so we want to make sure that that's set to sRGB gamma. So basically we don't really have to change anything, and that's the beauty of having this on by default. In the viewport, you can see that there's this little blue button, and that means that color management is on, and so our tissue colors look correct. If we turn that off, then what we're looking at is we're looking at the colors in linear space. So this is the underlying data that's defining our colors. This is our linear space down here, and it's not going to look right to our eyes. So we want to turn that on. In the same way, if we change this drop down to raw, it's going to do exactly the same thing. That's the linear space. But what we want to see is the sRGB gamma. If we choose like this material here, the color picker is also color managed. You can see that this color management checkbox is enabled on by default. So that means that the colors that we're picking are going to look right to our eyes, but the actual numerical data is going to be stored in linear space. If we turn that off again, we can see that this is jumping down to this darker, more saturated version that's representative of the linear space. In past versions of Maya, the color pickers were not color managed, and so it was really difficult to actually get the right colors for a linear workflow. So the color pickers are managed, the viewport is managed, and indeed our test renders, the viewport is, let's do a little test render of our tissue layer here. The test render viewer is color managed as well. You can see we've got this on, and we're viewing an sRGB gamma space, even though the calculations, the lighting information is happening in the linear space. So again, the beauty of this version of Maya is that we don't have to think about any of that. It's happening for us automatically. So I'm just going to hit escape to cancel this render because it'll take a little while. If we turn that off, again, we're seeing the linear version, or if we wanted to choose one of these different ones. This setting here is not changing the image in any way. It's just changing the color profile applied to it so that it looks different for our benefit. So if we're going to save this image, and this is what I kind of did incorrectly in the tutorial this morning, if we want to save this test render and we hit save image, this setting on the right here is really important. If we want to save a PNG or a JPEG, some format for the web or to email to someone, we want to save the color managed image, right? This is an ejection point in the pipeline. We want to save a color managed version of this image so that somebody can view it. If we saved it as the raw image, then what would be baked into that image would be this. And if we wanted to work with it later on, as we did before in After Effects, we would have to gamma correct it and manually add this color transformation into the sRGB space. So fortunately, Maya, again, makes this very simple. We just choose the Save Color Managed if we're going to be saving as a PNG or a JPEG or something like that, and we can save those images out. Now, we come back to the render settings for batch rendering. When we're batch rendering, do we want to apply an sRGB transformation to our batch rendered images? No. Okay. So I'm seeing heads shaking. No, right? We want to keep moving in this linear path. We don't want to apply any gamma correction. So we don't want to check this box. And what would happen is if we check this box, it's going to say apply the output transform to the rendered images. What's the output transform? Use the view transform. What's the view transform? the view transform is sRGB gamma. So essentially what this is doing here is saying when you render out these images, apply an sRGB gamma correction to the images. And if we were going to render these out and be done with those images, maybe we were rendering out a JPEG sequence and that was going to be it, that was going to be the end of our pipeline, then yes, that would be fine to do because this is the final ejection point. But because we're going to be taking these into After Effects and doing further work with them, we want to make sure that they stay in that linear space. So leave that unchecked. Okay, so now that we've rendered out, let's say we've rendered out our images as OpenEXR files, 16-bit images. In After Effects, I'm going to create a new project so you can see what the default state is. I'm embarrassed to admit that for the longest time when I thought, hey, I'm going to work with 16-bit images, I'm going to work with 32-bit images, OpenEXR to get the maximum data and the maximum benefit, and I can tweak them and I can play around with them, and things just didn't really work that well with compositing. I couldn't get the render passes to stack up right. I couldn't get color correction to really have the flexibility that I thought it should have, even though I was using a linear workflow in Maya. And the reason that that wasn't going so well is because After Effects by default is not set up for a linear workflow. And so what you need to do, I mean, I should say, it does work with the linear workflow, but there's a few things that you want to do to make sure that you get the maximum latitude and benefit in the compositing process. So the first thing you want to do with a new project is go File, Project Settings, and take a look at the color settings here. And my big embarrassing mistake was I didn't realize this, I left the depth to 8 bits per channel. So regardless if you're working in a linear workflow or not, although this kind of ties in nicely to that, if you're using higher bit depth images like those OpenEXRs, you want to make sure that your project will support that higher bit depth. So choose 32 bits per channel. And I think that's the safe choice, even if you're only rendering out 16-bit EXR files. 32 bits will make sure that those work, and something like a depth pass, which by default is 32 bits, will also be supported. Okay, so the working space, what do we want to choose for the working space? There's a bunch of options here. Remember that After Effects uses slightly different language for these sorts of color management settings than Maya does, but essentially the working space is asking, how do you want to view things in your compositing viewer? And the answer to that is sRGB. So in After Effects, we want to make sure that our working space is sRGB. And that's not quite enough, because we also need to ensure that the calculations that After Effects is doing are happening in the linear space. So it's a little bit not obvious, and I'm only about 85 to 90% sure that this is the correct way to set this up, but it seems to work and it makes sense to me, so I'm going to advise you to do the same thing. And so you want to choose sRGB, and you also want to click Linearize the working space. And the reason why I feel fairly confident about this is because After Effects gives you a handy little description here that says, I'll read it off for you, working space will be linearized, modified to have a 1.0 gamma. This affects all pixel blending operations, blending modes, imagery sampling, and motion blur. So like Henry was talking about in the Minute Physics video, when you're blurring images or blurring colors together, in order for those to happen correctly, you need to have a linearized working space. A linear working space more accurately reflects how colors blend naturally and may correct halos and fringing when high contrast saturated colors are blended together. Okay, so we want the working space as sRGB, linearize that, and now we're well set up for working with our high bit depth linear workflow scenes. So I'm going to open up the previous one just to show you a couple of things. So again, behind the scenes, it's linear space, but the way that this composition viewer is showing us is sRGB. Whoops. And if we look under the View menu, there's this option called Use Display Color Management. And that's a way to toggle what we're actually seeing. So similar to in Maya, how we were able to choose off and on for the color management. In After Effects, if we turn this off, now we're actually viewing the linear image. You can also, I believe it's shift / / on the numpad. So you've got a numpad on the right side of your keyboard, shift / and that'll toggle that view transformation on or off. So just like Maya, the calculations are happening in linear space, but After Effects is kind enough to be able to show us that gamma corrected color information. So we've been working our way across this workflow. What about the final ejection point? We're done with our animation. We want to export this to a movie file. If we go to File, Export, Add to Render Queue. I don't know if you've talked about exporting movies and stuff like that from After Effects, but it's not too complicated. In your current timeline, File, Export, Add to Render Queue. And in this render queue viewer, you've got this output module that's going to render out your animation. So we could specify, I'm not going to render this out, so whatever, specify some file name. And the output module has the settings that we want to consider for this final stage of our linear workflow. We can choose a format like QuickTime MOV, or I like H.264 as an output format. But the color management here is what we want to take a look at. And the output profile, again, we want just that one final transformation, so we're going to choose sRGB. And so if we choose sRGB, we can see the description here. The color values will be converted from that linear version to the output profile with a gamma of 2.2. And now that we've changed that, we could render it out and it should look correct. So that, in a nutshell, is linear workflow with appropriate viewing and ejection points along the pipeline. So are we done? Well, not quite. Hang on, there's one other issue here. And that is, what if we're using file textures that we've got from online or somewhere? If let's say we're going to change this color to a file texture, and we get a JPEG, like this colon environment. Is this JPEG in a linear space? No. It's probably most likely has an sRGB color profile. So when we're rendering an image, or rendering a file that has these images, how is Maya going to treat that? In the past, that was part of the headache. You had to manually go in and apply an inverse gamma correction to get those back into a linear space. Fortunately, nowadays, it's much simpler. Maya, by default, assigns these, or not, I shouldn't say assigns these, but interprets these as having an sRGB color space. So as long as we've told Maya that this has an sRGB color space, it's going to take that into consideration when rendering. The same thing as if you are painting an image texture in Photoshop, or even generating a PTEX or a texture in Mudbox. Those are going to have, unless you specify otherwise, by default those are going to have an sRGB color space. In fact, we can even prove that in Photoshop. We go to Edit Color Settings, and look, here's the working space is sRGB with the gamma of 2.1, interestingly enough, instead of 2.2, but pretty much the same. So anytime that we bring in an image, by default it should have this sRgb color space. All right. So how about though this HDR image? Does anybody want to hazard a guess, this HDR image, what color space that is in? Actually, it has a raw or a linear color space. HDR images are typically linear images. And so when you bring in an HDR image, Maya also is clever enough to assign it a color space of raw, which means it doesn't have a color space. It's in a linear space. So there's a couple, again, Maya's clever and has those by default. You can create your own color space rules. You can manually change things if they're supposed to be different, but you can also create new rules so that when you bring something in with an image extension of, or has a name of something, then to apply a certain color space. But by default, it's to use a color space of sRgb. So assigning a color space like this in Maya speak, applying a color transform is like saying, I know what color space this image is supposed to look like in order to look right and to be used properly in my scene. There's one other category of image files that we have to talk about, and we've already encountered those. What about bump maps? What about normal maps? What about displacement maps? What color space should those be in? Well, a good rule of thumb is if an image is visual, like color information, a painted texture, and it's not a high dynamic range, an HDR image, then the color space should be sRgb. But if the image has to do with data, numerical values like displacement or bump or normal maps or specular maps or reflectivity or transparency maps, what you've been painting is numerical values, and those should not be skewed. So the rule of thumb is bump maps, normal maps, other data-driven textures should have a raw color space. So if we wanted to, we could add a rule for that and say, with an image name pattern of anything, bump, anything, then keep it raw, sort of thing. So that is the sort of sum total of linear workflow. Pretty much everything is set to go with the defaults. Really the only thing you need to be careful about is setting up your project in After Effects properly and making sure that your bump textures and other data-driven textures don't accidentally get that sRgb color space assigned to them.